My grandfather looked at me from the hospital lobby chair, his hands folded over a small paper bag of medications, and before I could even say hello, he leaned close and whispered 5 words that changed everything. "Don't take me home." I thought I'd misheard him. I hadn't. What came next would unravel a secret my own family had been hiding for months. The message came through at 0640. While I was standing in a supply line checking equipment with my platoon, my phone buzzed against my hip and I almost ignored it. We don't check phones during formation. But something made me glance down. "Your grandfather is being discharged today. Can you pick him up?" It was from my mother, no explanation, no context, just that sitting there on a screen while I stood in the Georgia heat with 40 pounds of gear on my back. I typed back one word, "Dad." She didn't answer for almost 20 minutes. When she finally did, it wasn't an answer at all. He said he's busy. "Can you handle it?" I stared at that sentence longer than I should have. My father lived 11 minutes from the hospital. I was over 3 hours away in the middle of a training rotation I couldn't just walk off of, but I called him anyway because something about the silence around this felt wrong before I even knew why. "Dad, I'm at Benning. I can't just leave post." "Well, somebody needs to get him," he said like I was the one being unreasonable. "I've got a thing with work. Linda's got her hair appointment. You know how she gets if she cancels. A hair appointment." My grandfather, 82 years old, recovering from a fall that put him in the hospital for 4 days. And the reason my father couldn't drive 11 minutes was a hair appointment. He wasn't even having Linda was. I called Daniel next. My younger brother picked up on the second ring already talking before I could ask. "Look, I've got a shift. I can't just bail. They'll write me up." "It's Grandpa Daniel." I know, but I really can't right now." I hung up and sat with that for a moment, my thumb hovering over Carol's name. My cousin was the one who usually handled things like this. She brought him groceries, drove him to appointments, sat with him on Sundays. If anyone would go, it was her. She answered on the first ring, which should have told me something. "Margaret, I can't drive that far today. I've got the kids, and honestly, hospitals stress me out. Nobody could do it." Not one person in a family of 4 adults living within a 30-minute radius of that hospital could find an hour to bring an old man home. I looked at the mission board pinned outside our company office. I looked at the CEO's door, and then I did something I don't do lightly. I asked to speak with him off the record, explained the situation in the fewest words possible, because that's how you talk to a commander who respects efficiency. He looked at me for a second, then said, "Finish the equipment check, sign off with your platoon sergeant and go. Family comes first when it's real." This sounds real. It took me 4 hours to drive there. I didn't stop except for gas. I kept running numbers in my head, miles, minutes, the last time I'd actually sat across from my grandfather. Instead of talking to him for 6 minutes on the phone during a drive somewhere, it had been longer than I wanted to admit. When I walked into that hospital lobby, I saw him before he saw me. He was sitting near the window in a wheelchair he clearly didn't need anymore. A small paper bag of prescriptions in his lap, his jacket buttoned wrong on one side. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not frail exactly. George Hayes had never been frail a day in his life. Not the man who built half the roads in that county with his own hands, but diminished somehow, like something had been pulled out of him that hadn't gone back in yet. Then he saw me, and his whole face changed. "I knew you'd come," he said, and his voice cracked in a way I'd never heard before. I crouched down next to the wheelchair and squeezed his hand. "Of course I came, Grandpa. Let's get you home." He didn't answer that. He just nodded slow and let me help him stand, one arm looped through mine, his grip tighter than I expected for a man his age. I signed the discharge paperwork, thanked the nurse, and walked him out to the truck, matching his pace, which had gotten noticeably slower since the last time I'd seen him walk anywhere. I got him settled in the passenger seat, buckled him in like he was a kid again, and pulled out of the parking lot toward the highway that led back to his house. The house he'd lived in for over 50 years, the house my father grew up in. We were maybe 10 minutes down the road, the radio playing low when I noticed him watching the side mirror, then the rear view. Then he leaned toward me closer than a man usually leans, unless something is wrong. and his voice dropped to barely more than a breath. "Don't take me home." I glanced at him, certain I'd misunderstood. "What?" He looked straight ahead now, jaw tight, hands folded in his lap like he was holding something in. "Take me to a lawyer." I felt my grip shift on the steering wheel. "Grandpa, why?" He turned to me then, and there was something in his eyes I'd never seen on him before. Not confusion, not fear, exactly, but the look of a man who had been waiting a long time to say something out loud. "Because if I go home tonight," he said quietly, "I may never get another chance to tell you the truth." I didn't press him. Not right away. Whatever he needed to say, it clearly wasn't something he wanted to say at 65 miles per hour on a highway with his hands shaking in his lap. So, I did the only thing that made sense. I found the nearest exit, pulled into a gas station, and just sat there with him for a minute in the quiet. "Grandpa, talk to me when you're ready." "I'm not going anywhere." He nodded, staring out the windshield at nothing in particular, and after a long moment he said, "Not here. Somewhere with a bed. I haven't slept right in 4 days that I could do." I found a small hotel about 15 minutes from a law office I remembered him mentioning years ago. Eleanor Brooks, a name that had come up at holidays, sometimes always in the context of your grandmother's will or the trust papers. It was too late in the day to go there directly past 5 now. So I got him a room-ordered soup from the diner next door, because it was the only thing on the menu that looked like something his stomach could handle, and sat with him while he ate. He was quiet for a long time. Then somewhere between the soup and the second cup of decaf, it started coming out. "Your father came by the house a few weeks back," he said. Before all this, he gestured vaguely at himself at the hospital bracelet still on his wrist. "Said I couldn't keep living alone. Said it was time to think about assisted living." I kept my face neutral. "What did you say?" I said I'd think about it. Seemed reasonable enough at the time. "I'm 82, Margaret. I know I'm not going to live in that house forever." He turned the coffee cup slowly on the table, not drinking it. But then he came back a few days later with papers, lots of papers, said I just needed to sign so they could help manage things. Something in my chest went very still. "Did you sign them?" "No," he said it firmly, like the one thing in this whole mess he was certain of. I didn't understand half of what they said. Didn't like that he wanted me to sign before I'd even read it properly. I told him I needed time. He paused. Next day, I fell in the kitchen, hit my head on the counter, woke up in that hospital bed. I didn't say what I was thinking. I didn't say it out loud. Not yet, because it was too early, too speculative. And I've learned in 12 years of service that jumping to conclusions before you have facts gets people hurt sometimes, literally. But the timeline sat in my stomach like a stone. The next morning, I called Eleanor Brooks. Her office could see us at 11. She was older than I expected, sharp-eyed, maybe 70, with the kind of quiet, unhurried manner of someone who had spent decades listening to people's worst family moments and learned not to react to any of them on the surface. She greeted my grandfather warmly like an old friend, which apparently he was. "George, it's been a while." She looked at me. "And you must be Margaret. I remember you from your grandmother's service." We sat down across from her desk, and she pulled a thick folder from a locked cabinet behind her. "So," she said, opening it, "let's start with what I have on file. You've got a revocable living trust from about 8 years ago. A power of attorney naming Richard as your agent in case of incapacity, and a will that splits the estate between Richard and Daniel with a smaller provision for you, Margaret, and for Carol." She looked up. "That's the last version I have on record." "That sounds right," George said, but Eleanor set down a second, thinner folder. "A colleague of mine at the county recorder's office flagged something for me 2 days ago. A new document was filed recently. It restructures how certain assets are held, including, potentially, the house." My stomach tightened. "Did Grandpa sign them?" "That's what I need to find out." Eleanor slid a photocopy across the desk. "This is the signature page." George reached for it slowly, adjusting his glasses, and stared at the looping signature at the bottom of the page for a long moment. The room was quiet, except for the hum of the office air conditioning. Then he set the paper down, and when he looked up at me, his face had gone pale in a way that had nothing to do with his 4 days in a hospital bed. "That's not my signature." I looked down at the page again, at the name George Hayes, written in ink that was supposed to be his on a document he apparently never saw filed sometime while he was recovering from a fall that had happened. One day after he refused to sign the very same kind of paperwork. I didn't say anything. I didn't trust myself. Eleanor watched us both carefully the way I imagined. She'd watched 100 families before us sitting in those same chairs, right before everything they thought they knew about each other started coming apart. Eleanor didn't let the moment sit for long. She'd clearly seen shock before, and she knew the difference between giving someone space to feel it and letting them drown in it. "I want to be careful here," she said, closing the thinner folder, but keeping it close. "A signature that doesn't look right isn't proof of anything on its own. People's handwriting changes. Stress changes it. Age changes it." She looked at George with something like gentleness. "But given what you've just told me and given the timing, I think we need to treat this seriously." "How seriously?" And I asked. "If that signature is forged, we're not talking about a family disagreement anymore. We're talking about fraud, elder financial exploitation, possibly unauthorized use of a power of attorney. If someone acted outside the scope of what your grandfather actually authorized." She said the words plainly without drama, the way you'd read off a checklist. "I'm not saying that's what happened. I'm saying it's what we need to rule in or rule out." George sat very still through all of it, his hands folded in his lap, staring at a spot on Eleanor's desk like it might give him an answer neither of us could. "I don't want to think it was Richard," he said quietly. "He's my son." "I know," Eleanor said, "and we're not accusing anyone yet. We're gathering facts. That's all this is right now." I asked her what came next, and she laid it out. Pull the full notary record for the new filing request bank and property records, cross-reference the timeline with the hospital admission. It would take a few days. In the meantime, she suggested George stay somewhere quiet, somewhere he could rest without pressure, and that I not say anything to the family about where he was. "Not because you're hiding something wrong," she clarified, seeing the look on my face. "Because if there is something wrong, the people involved need to not know we're looking yet." I drove back to base that afternoon once George was settled, my mind running through the conversation on a loop the whole way. When my rotation wrapped 2 days later, I went home to my parents' house, the one I'd grown up in, 20 minutes from George's. My father was waiting on the porch before I'd even turned off the engine. That told me something too. He didn't wait on porches for anyone. "Where's your grandfather?" He didn't say hello, didn't ask how the drive was. "He's safe," I said, getting out of the truck. "Safe where Margaret he needs to be home. He needs his routine, his doctor's nearby. He's safe, Dad. That's all I'm going to say right now." Something flickered across his face. Not sadness, not concerned, something closer to alarm. "What did he tell you?" I watched him carefully. "Why does it matter what he told me?" "Because he's confused, Margaret." He fell and hit his head. Old men say things after a fall like that. You can't take everything he says as gospel. I hadn't told him anything about signatures, forged documents, or lawyers. I hadn't told him a single specific detail. And yet, here was my father, unprompted, already building a case for why his own father's memory couldn't be trusted. "I never said he told me anything specific," I said slowly. My father's jaw tightened, and for just a second, less than a second, really, something crossed his face that I can only describe as fear. Then it was gone, replaced by frustration, the kind he'd always used to end conversations he didn't like. "You're putting ideas in his head. You show up once every few months, and suddenly you know what's best for this family." I didn't answer that. I didn't need to. I just looked at him the same way Eleanor had looked at both of us across her desk, steady, quiet, gathering information instead of giving it away. 3 days later, Eleanor called. I drove out to her office that evening. "I pulled the notarization records," she said, sliding a page across the desk. "The new document was notarized on the 14th, filed with the county on the 16th. "Okay," I said. "What's on it?" "Richard is named as financial manager with expanded authority. Several assets, including funds previously held solely by your grandfather, were restructured into a newly formed LLC." She paused. "And the house, George's house, it's listed as a related asset within that same structure." I felt something settle in my chest, cold and heavy, but Grandpa says he never agreed to any of this. He didn't, Eleanor said. I believe him, and I think you do too. She leaned back, slightly, studying me the way she had that first day, like she was deciding how much weight I could carry. Margaret, she said finally, I don't think your grandfather asked you to pick him up, because he was afraid to be alone. She pushed the folder toward me, its edges lined up perfectly straight, like everything else about her. I think he asked you because he knew you were the only person in this family he could still trust. I didn't sleep much that week. Not because of anything dramatic, no confrontations, no shouting matches, nothing that would make for an easy story. Just the quiet, grinding work of trying to understand a family I thought I already knew. I started with Daniel, not because I suspected him of anything, but because he was the one person in the family who'd never learned to hide what he was feeling. I called him under the pretense of catching up, and it didn't take long before he mentioned almost in passing that he'd taken out a loan a few months back that hadn't gone the way he planned. It's fine, he said quickly. The way people say things when they're not fine. Dad's helping me sort it out. Helping how? I don't know, Margaret, just helping like he always does. A pause. Why does it matter? It mattered because 2 days earlier, Eleanor had shown me an email pulled from a shared family cloud account. George still had access to one Richard apparently forgot, still synced to his father's old laptop. The email was from Richard to Carol sent 4 months ago. 2 lines, nothing else. Once Dad moves, we can finally settle the property issue. Don't mention anything to him yet. Let's wait until the assisted living conversation is further along. Settle the property issue, not make sure Dad's comfortable, not figure out his care, the property issue. I thought about every time over the past year my father had brought up assisted living, always with the same tone, always framed as concern. I thought about Carol, who visited George every week with groceries and warm conversation, and who had also, according to the notary logs Eleanor pulled, been present at the office where the disputed document was filed, present, but not as a witness, as the one who dropped it off. Everyone kept saying the same thing in different words. We're just trying to help Grandpa. But grocery runs don't restructure a man's assets into an LLC. Warm conversation doesn't file paperwork with a signature nobody remembers signing. I went to see my father again alone this time. No audience, no porch theatrics. I found him in his garage going through old tools like he always did when he needed something to do with his hands. Did Grandpa authorize the new documents? I asked. No preamble. I'd learned by now that giving him room to build a story first only made it harder to get a straight answer later. He didn't look up right away. He turned a wrench over in his hand, set it down, picked up another one. You have no idea what this family has done for you, he said finally. Every opportunity you've had, every. That's not what I asked. The silence stretched longer than I expected. Long enough that I almost repeated the question. Then he set the second wrench down too, and looked at me for the first time since I'd walked in. He was confused, Richard said. 4 words, quiet ones. But I understood immediately what they were doing, not answering my question, but laying groundwork. If George could be framed as confused, unreliable a man whose memory couldn't be trusted after a fall, then any objection he raised later could be dismissed before it was even heard. It wasn't a defense. It was a strategy. He's not confused, Dad. He remembers exactly what he did and didn't sign. You weren't there, Margaret. You don't get to decide that from 3 hours away. I'm here now. He didn't have anything to say to that. He just looked away back down at his tools like the conversation had ended. Whether he wanted it to or not, I drove back to the hotel that evening, where George was still staying quieter than he liked, but safer than home. I hadn't told him everything yet. Not the email, not the LLC, not the conversation in the garage. I didn't want to hand him more weight than he could carry in one sitting. He'd already lost enough sleep that week. My phone rang just as I pulled into the parking lot. Eleanor, I found something else, she said, and I could hear something different in her voice. Not alarm exactly, but the careful control of someone delivering news they know is going to matter. What? The original deed to your grandfather's house doesn't say what your father thinks it says. I sat there in the truck engine offhand, still on the wheel, waiting for her to explain, but she didn't nod over the phone. "Come by the office tomorrow morning," she said. "You'll want to see this in person." Eleanor's office smelled like coffee and old paper when I walked in the next morning. The kind of smell that comes from decades of filing cabinets nobody's thrown out. She had 3 folders lined up on her desk, already edges squared, waiting. "Sit," she said. "This is going to take a minute to explain properly." I sat. She opened the first folder, the county property record for George's house, the one he'd lived in since before my father was born. "Your grandfather is still the sole legal owner of that house," she said. "Full stop. Whatever your father believes, whatever assumptions have been made in that family about who controls what, the deed has never changed. Richard was never granted ownership. Not partial, not full. So the new document doesn't actually transfer ownership. It couldn't legally, not with a forged or improperly executed signature. What it does is create the appearance of authority. If nobody challenges it, if George doesn't have someone in his corner who knows how to read these things, that appearance can start functioning like reality. People stop asking questions. Decisions get made. Money moves." She tapped the folder. "This is why they needed the signature in the first place. Without it, they have nothing." I felt something in me settle slightly. Relief. Maybe that George hadn't already lost the one thing he'd spent his whole working life building. But it didn't last long because Eleanor opened the second folder. "Here's where it gets more complicated," she said. "I pulled this from a contact I have who does title work. Someone submitted a mortgage application using your grandfather's property as collateral filed 6 weeks ago." I stared at the paper in front of me. George's name, George's address, a loan amount that made my stomach turn, and a signature at the bottom that looked exactly like the one on the estate documents, which was to say nothing like George's actual signature. "He didn't apply for a mortgage," I said. It wasn't a question. No, he didn't. Someone used his information. His social security number, his property, quite possibly a signature they'd already practiced, forging on the first document, to attempt to borrow against a house they didn't own and didn't have legal authority over. Eleanor folded her hands. "That's not a family disagreement anymore, Margaret. That's identity misuse. That's a crime." I wanted to drive straight to my father's house. I wanted to put the papers on his kitchen table and ask him to explain right there, face to face. No more garage tools to hide behind. Every instinct I had, the same instincts that had gotten me through firefights and convoy ambushes, was telling me to move, to confront, to force the truth out into the open before it could hide again. Eleanor must have seen it on my face, because she reached across the desk and put her hand flat on the folder, like she was holding it. And me still. "Don't accuse anyone until we have the records," she said. "I mean that. Not because I don't believe you, and not because I think your father's innocent. I mean it because the moment you accuse someone without proof, they get to control the story. Right now we control it. Facts first, emotions second. That's how you win something like this. Not by being right, but by being unshakable." It was the kind of thing my old drill sergeant used to say, dressed up in different words. Facts first. I'd built an entire career on that principle. It felt strange and oddly comforting to hear it applied here in a quiet law office to my own family. So we did it her way. Over the next 4 days, we gathered everything methodically. Bank records showing the flow of funds tied to Daniel's loan property, records confirming George's uncontested ownership, notary logs, hospital admission, and discharge times, copies of both the disputed estate document and the mortgage application side by side. And that was where the real crack appeared. The notary record for the estate document listed a signing date and time, a Tuesday afternoon, 3:15. Eleanor cross-referenced it against George's hospital chart, which she'd obtained with his written consent. At 3:15 that Tuesday, George Hayes was lying in a hospital bed, connected to a monitor 12 meters away from the notary's office listed on the form. He could not have been in 2 places at once. He could not have signed anything at that office at that time, because he wasn't there. He was recovering from a fall that had happened coincidentally, or not exactly 1 day after he'd refused to sign similar paperwork at home. I stared at the 2 documents, laid side by side on Eleanor's desk, the hospital timestamp, and the notary date, and understood with a clarity that felt almost physical that someone hadn't just forged a signature. Someone had lied about where my grandfather was on one of the worst days of his life and used that lie to make a theft look like a signature. Eleanor called the meeting for a Saturday afternoon at her office on neutral ground. She said it needed to happen somewhere formal, somewhere that reminded everyone this wasn't a kitchen table conversation anymore. I picked George up from the hotel that morning. He'd put on a collared shirt, the kind he used to wear to church, and when I asked if he was ready, he just nodded once and said, "Past time." My parents arrived first, Daniel a few minutes after Carol last sliding into the office, looking like she already knew something was wrong, but wasn't sure what. They took seats around Eleanor's conference table, and I watched my father's face as he registered that this wasn't going to be the conversation he expected. I think he believed he was walking into a meeting where I'd be asked to apologize, where the family would gently explain that I'd overreacted, that George was fine, that it was time to bring him home and put this behind us. He had that look, the confident, slightly impatient look of a man expecting to win. "This is a family matter," he said before Eleanor had even finished sitting down. "I don't understand why we need a lawyer's office for this." "No," Eleanor said, calm and unhurried, opening the first folder. The moment financial documents were falsified, it stopped being just a family matter. The room went very still. She laid the papers out one at a time methodically, the way she'd laid them out for me days earlier. The original deed showing George's sole owner, the new document showing the restructured LLC, the hospital records showing George's location at the exact time he was supposedly signing papers across town, the notary log with its impossible timestamp, the mortgage application with its forged signature, and finally, the email Richard's own words printed out and placed last, like the period at the end of a very long sentence. "Once Dad moves, we can finally settle the property issue." Richard read it. I watched him read it. His jaw worked but nothing came out. "Dad." Daniel's voice cracked slightly, and he turned in his chair, staring at our father with an expression I'd never seen on my brother before. Not anger exactly, more like the floor had opened under him. "What did you do?" "I didn't do anything that wasn't going to happen eventually," Richard said too fast, the words tumbling out before he could organize them into something more defensible. "He can't manage that house alone anymore. Someone had to make decisions. Someone had to forge his signature." Daniel's voice rose. Someone had to take out a loan using his name while he was in the hospital. Richard's composure cracked further. He turned toward Carol. "You handled the notary appointment. You were supposed to make sure everything was I did what you told me to do." Carol snapped back her face, flushing. "You said he'd already agreed. You said it was just a formality." "I never said that." "You absolutely said that, Richard." My mother, who had been silent the entire time, hands folded tightly in her lap, finally spoke, and her voice was thick. "I didn't know about any of this. I swear I didn't know." I believed her mostly. She'd always been the kind of person who preferred not to ask too many questions about things that made her uncomfortable, which wasn't the same as innocence, but wasn't the same as guilt either. Through all of it, George sat quietly at the head of the table, watching his son, his granddaughter, his niece, and his daughter-in-law come apart in real time. He hadn't said a word since we'd walked in. When he finally did, the room went silent immediately, like it understood instinctively that this was the voice that mattered most. "I spent my whole life building that house," he said, his voice steady despite everything. Poured the foundation myself one summer back, when I could still lift concrete without my back giving out, raised my son in it, buried my wife from it. He looked around the table slowly, meeting each set of eyes in turn. "I never imagined I'd have to protect it from my own family. Nobody had an answer for that. Not Richard, not Carol, not anyone." Eleanor let the silence sit for a moment before she reached into the last folder on the table, one she hadn't opened yet. "There's one more thing Margaret doesn't know," she said. I looked at her, and something in her tone made my chest tighten. "What?" She pulled out a single document, old and slightly yellowed at the edges, clearly older than anything else on the table. "Your grandfather changed his estate plan 6 months ago," she said, "before any of this happened, before the hospital, before the disputed documents, before any of it." I turned to George. He was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not guilt, not triumph. Something quieter than either. Grandpa, he didn't answer right away. He just reached over and put his hand over mine on the table, the way he used to when I was small and scared of something in the dark. "We'll talk about it Sunday," he said. "Just the two of us. There's something you need to hear, and this isn't the room for it." Sunday came slow. George had asked me to pick him up in the morning. No explanation, just a time and a request that I come alone. I found him waiting on the porch of a house he'd finally been cleared to return to. Eleanor had spent the week working with the district attorney's office on the mortgage fraud and forged signature, and while the legal process would take months to fully resolve, George's ownership had never been in question. The house was his. It always had been. He looked better than he had in weeks. Color back in his face, steadier on his feet. He'd made coffee, which surprised me. I hadn't seen him cook or prepare anything for himself since before the hospital. We sat on the porch, the same porch he used to sit on with my grandmother, 2 mugs between us, and for a while neither of us said anything. That was fine. Some of the best conversations I've had in my life started with a long, comfortable silence first. "You want to know about the estate plan?" he said eventually. "Not a question, only if you want to tell me." He smiled a little at that. "That's exactly why I'm telling you." He explained it slowly, the way he explained things, when he wanted to make sure I understood not just the what, but the why. 6 months ago, after my grandmother's second cousin passed and left a mess of an estate behind, family fighting over furniture, over money, over who visited more in the final years, George had sat with his own mortality in a way he hadn't before. He went to Eleanor and asked her to help him think it through properly. "I didn't change anything, because I loved you more than your father or your brother," he said. "I want you to hear that clearly. This isn't a story about favorites. Then what is it about?" He turned his mug slowly in his hands the way he used to turn tools over when he was thinking. "For 6 months I watched how everyone talked to me." He said, "Your father called every week. Every single week like clockwork, and every call somewhere in the first 5 minutes, he'd bring up the house. Whether I'd thought more about assisted living, whether I'd looked at listing it, whether I'd talked to anyone about simplifying things." He shook his head slightly. "Carol was kind to me. She really was, but even her visits started turning into conversations about paperwork, about power of attorney, about making things easier down the road. And Daniel needed things, money mostly, and I don't blame him for that. He's had a hard few years, but every conversation eventually got there too." He looked at me, then steady, the same look he'd given me across the truck that first day. "You never asked me for anything, Margaret. Not once in 6 months. You called to ask if I was eating enough. You asked about my knee, about whether the medication was working, about some show you thought I'd like. You never once asked what would happen to this house." I felt my throat tighten, and I didn't trust my voice enough to say anything right away. "Everyone else asked what would happen to the house," he said quietly. "You were the only one who asked if I was eating enough." We sat with that for a while. The legal outcome when it came was almost secondary to that moment, though it mattered. Of course it mattered. The forged documents were voided. The mortgage application was flagged as fraudulent and stopped before any funds were released. Eleanor worked with the DA's office on the broader pattern of exploitation, and whatever consequences followed for Richard and Carol would play out through channels far more formal than a family dinner table. George kept full control of everything that was rightfully his. That part of the story ended the way it should have, but it wasn't the ending that mattered most to me. A few days later, I went to see my father, not to gloat, not to punish him further than the situation already had, just to say something I needed him to hear clearly once. "I didn't take Grandpa away from you," I told him. He didn't look at me. He was sitting at his kitchen table, the same table where I'd eaten 1,000 dinners, growing up, looking older than I'd ever seen him look. "You pushed him away," I said, "when you treated his home like it already belonged to you." He didn't have an answer. I hadn't expected one. Weeks later, George and I sat on that same porch again, and the evening cooling around us, the kind of quiet that only exists in a house that finally feels safe. He asked me, almost teasing if I knew why he'd asked me to take him to a lawyer that day instead of home. Because you knew I wouldn't ask questions until you were ready, I said. He shook his head, smiling. No, because you were the only person I knew would take me somewhere safe without asking what you'd get in return. I looked out at the house, the roof he'd built himself one summer, the porch steps he'd repaired every few years without ever complaining about it, the whole quiet, solid weight of a life spent building something worth protecting. I realized then that the biggest secret in this whole story was never really about money or property or who owned what. It was about who still showed up when there was nothing to gain from it. I drove 190 miles that day because my grandfather needed a ride. I didn't know I was driving him toward the truth. If this story moved you, I'd love to know where it found you. Drop a comment below and tell me, are you the one in your family who always shows up? No questions asked. We've got so many more stories like this one to share with you. So, make sure you subscribe and never miss a moment like this again. Let's keep this journey going. The moment I felt his hand grip my wrist and twist my sleeve up in front of 30 relatives, I knew this wasn't going to end with an apology. Everyone look at this, Ryan said, holding my arm up like a trophy. You want to know what my sister actually does? She lives off mom and dad's money and plays soldier on the weekends. The room went quiet. Somewhere behind me, a man I didn't recognize went very still, staring at the scar running down my forearm like he'd seen it somewhere before. I just smiled and pulled my arm back. My father turned 70 that Saturday, and my mother had spent 3 weeks planning the party, string lights across the backyard, a caterer from downtown, cousins flying in from 3 different states. I'd landed at Fort Campbell 2 days earlier after 9 months running logistics for a joint training rotation, and the only thing I wanted was to sit in a lawn chair with a plate of my mother's potato salad and not think about supply chains or convoy routes for 48 hours. I wore a simple blue dress, no uniform, no rank insignia, nothing that would draw a single question I didn't want to answer that day. It didn't matter. Ryan made sure the questions came anyway. My brother has always needed a stage. He's 39, 5 years older than me, and he runs the construction company our father built from nothing. Cooper Builders, the sign still says, though our father hasn't picked up a hammer in over a decade. Ryan's good at talking. He's good at making a room believe things are better than they are, which is a skill that works wonders at a birthday party and considerably less well when a bank is asking about receivables. I didn't know that part yet. Nobody did, except maybe Megan, his wife, who spent most of the afternoon watching him with an expression I couldn't quite place. He started in on me before we'd even finished the first course. So, what's the army got you doing these days? He asked loud enough for our Uncle Pete to hear from across the yard. I said something vague about training coordination, the kind of answer I've given 100 times to people who don't actually want the real one. Ryan laughed before I'd even finished the sentence. Training coordination, he repeated, grinning at the table, like he'd caught me in something. That's a nice way of saying paperwork. You know what my little sister's actual job is? He looked around, gathering the room the way he always does, waiting until every fork stopped moving. She sits on a base somewhere and lets the government pay her rent. Meanwhile, mom and dad still send her care packages like she's 12 years old. A few people chuckled, uncertain, the kind of laugh people give when they're not sure if it's a joke or not. My mother's face tightened. My father stared at his plate. I didn't say anything. There's a particular kind of quiet you learn to hold on to in this job. A stillness that has nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with knowing that the loudest person in the room is rarely the one who understands what's actually happening. I've held that stillness through worse rooms than my brother's dining table. I held it now, and I reached for my water glass instead of a response. That only encouraged him. No. Seriously, Ryan said, turning to our cousin's husband, a man named Greg, who I'd met maybe twice in my life. She's never had a real job, not one, straight snorts out of high school into the army, and she's been letting Uncle Sam and Mom and Dad take care of her ever since. Meanwhile, I built a company from the ground up. He gestured at himself, at his watch, at the catering spread behind him, like it was evidence in a trial. only he was allowed to argue, but sure. Let's all pretend she's doing something impressive out there. Someone near the drink table asked not unkindly if I was still active duty. I nodded. Ryan cut back in before I could add anything. Barely, he said. She's basically on an extended vacation with a paycheck. My mother started to say something, but my father put a hand on her arm the way he does when he's decided a fight isn't worth having in front of guests. I understood that. I've made the same calculation more times than I can count, when to let a comment die in the air rather than give it the oxygen of a response. I reached for the linen napkin folded beside my plate, and as I unfolded it across my lap, my sleeve slid up an inch past my wrist. It wasn't deliberate. I don't think about the scar much anymore. It's just part of my arm the way a scar becomes part of anyone's arm after enough years. But someone at the far end of the table noticed. I felt it before I saw it, a shift in attention. A stillness that didn't match the rest of the room's noise. I glanced over and found Daniel Brooks watching me. Ryan's oldest friend, his best man at the wedding 11 years ago. A broad-shouldered guy who'd said maybe 6 words to me all afternoon, beyond a polite hello. He wasn't looking at my face. He was looking at my wrist, at the long pale line that ran from just below my palm toward my elbow. And something had changed behind his eyes, recognition or the beginning of it. The look of a man doing math he didn't expect to be doing at a birthday party. Ryan kept talking. Something about property values, about how people who serve get treated like heroes, for doing what he called a government job with better marketing. I stopped listening. I was watching Daniel instead, watching him set his drink down slowly on the table behind him, watching him glance once more at my arm, and then, without a word to anyone, turn and walk toward the side gate that led out to the driveway. Nobody else seemed to notice him leave. My mother was refilling drinks. My father was still holding his fork, without eating. Ryan was still talking, still building the version of me he needed the room to believe in. I didn't know yet what Daniel was about to set in motion. I only knew that for the first time all afternoon, someone in that yard had actually looked at me and seen something true. Daniel Brooks didn't walk out to the driveway to get air. He walked out there to make a phone call, and I wouldn't understand the weight of that call until much later that evening. I found out afterward what he'd been thinking in those first few minutes, standing by his truck with his phone in his hand, staring at the screen without dialing. Before Ryan's construction company, before 11 years of Sunday barbecues and fantasy football leagues, Daniel had spent 6 years in the 75th Ranger Regiment. He'd left the service the way a lot of guys do, quietly without much fanfare, trading deployments for a job managing warehouse logistics, and a life that looked from the outside entirely ordinary. But some things don't leave you, just because you've left them behind. A scar like mine has a shape to it that most people never learn to read. Daniel had learned. He'd seen it on men he served beside, on friends who didn't come home the same, and once years ago secondhand in a story that had circulated through certain circles, the way stories do among people who understand what they cost. The story was about a young officer, a logistics captain at the time, who'd been riding in a convoy near a forward operating base when an IED went off under the second vehicle. Most versions of the story Daniel had heard were fragments, a name half remembered, a unit designation, the kind of detail that gets passed along at reunions and dinners until it becomes more myth than memory. But one detail had stuck with him clearly. The officer had gone back into the wreckage twice, past the point anyone would have blamed her for stopping to pull 2 soldiers out before the vehicle caught fire. She'd taken shrapnel across her forearm doing it. The name attached to that story, the one Daniel had heard repeated with a kind of reverence reserved for people who don't tell it themselves, was Audrey Cooper. He told me later that he almost convinced himself it was a coincidence. Cooper isn't an unusual name, but the scar was unusual, and the timeline was unusual, and something in the careful, unbothered way I'd sat through Ryan's insults all afternoon reminded him of men he'd known, who carried real weight and never once mentioned it at a party. So, instead of getting back in his truck, he came back inside. He found me near the kitchen helping my mother wrap the leftover cake in foil, and he asked if he could speak with me for a moment. His voice was quieter, then I'd heard it all day. None of the easy backslapping tone he used with Ryan. "This is going to sound strange," he said. "But were you ever stationed at Fort Campbell around 8-9 years ago?" I told him yes. He asked if I'd served with the 101st Sustainment Brigade. Yes. Again. He asked carefully, almost like he didn't want to be right, whether I'd been part of a convoy that hid an IED outside a forward base in Regional Command East. I didn't answer right away. There are things I don't talk about, not because I'm ashamed of them, but because talking about them doesn't change what happened, and it tends to make other people uncomfortable in ways I've stopped having the patience for. But something in Daniel's face told me he wasn't asking out of curiosity. He was asking because he already knew, and he needed to hear it confirmed by the person it happened to, rather than a rumor that had traveled through years and hands until it barely resembled the truth. "Yes," I said, and that was me. He exhaled like he'd been holding his breath since the driveway. Then he asked me 2 more questions, small details, the kind only someone who'd actually served nearby would think to ask: the call sign of the unit we'd been operating with, the approximate date. I answered both. Each answer seemed to land on him like another piece of a picture locking into place. He didn't say much after that. He thanked me, which struck me as an odd thing to say, and then he excused himself and stepped back outside. I went back to wrapping the cake, assuming that was the end of it. An old story confirmed a strange little moment of recognition between 2 people who'd once worn the same uniform in different corners of the world. I didn't realize Daniel had pulled out his phone again until much later. He called a friend still on active duty, someone he'd stayed close with since leaving the Rangers, a man now working logistics coordination out of a battalion staff office. Daniel kept his voice low, standing near the fence line, where the party noise wouldn't carry. "I need you to confirm something for me," he said. "A name. Audrey Cooper. Major, I think Sustainment Brigade, formerly Fort Campbell." There was a pause on the other end, longer than Daniel expected. He told me afterward that the silence itself was strange, not confusion, but something closer to caution, like the person on the other end was deciding how much he was allowed to say over an open line. Finally, the voice came back. "Where are you right now?" Daniel gave the address without thinking much of it, still assuming this was just a formality, a way of closing the loop on a story he'd wondered about for years. "Don't go anywhere," the voice said. "Stay right there." Daniel stood by the fence for a moment after the call ended, phone still in his hand, looking back toward the house, where Ryan's laughter carried out through the open windows, where I was still inside, pretending the last 10 minutes hadn't happened at all. He didn't know exactly what was about to happen, but something in that voice told him it wasn't nothing. And for the first time since he'd walked into that backyard, Daniel Brooks felt like he needed to stay close and watch. Ryan had no idea anything had shifted. He was still holding court by the dessert table, recycling the same jokes about my government vacation to anyone who hadn't heard them the first time, refilling his glass, basking in the kind of attention and always mistaken for respect. I moved through the party the way I usually do at these things, present but peripheral, helping my mother keep the food trays full, answering questions with as few words as I could manage. I didn't know Daniel had made a phone call. I didn't know anyone was coming. What I noticed gradually was Daniel himself. He'd come back inside after his conversation by the fence, but he wasn't the same relaxed guy who'd been trading stories with Ryan an hour earlier. He kept checking his phone. He kept glancing toward the front of the house, toward the street, in a way that had nothing to do with the party happening around him. Twice I caught him watching me from across the yard, and both times he looked away too quickly, like a man trying not to stare at something he wasn't sure he was allowed to see yet. I've spent enough years around people under pressure to recognize the signs, even when they're trying to hide them. Daniel's shoulders had gone rigid. His jaw was set in a way that didn't match small talk at a birthday party. I almost asked him if something was wrong, but before I could, his phone buzzed again, and he stepped away from the crowd to answer it, cupping his hand around the screen, like he didn't want anyone reading it over his shoulder. I didn't hear most of that second call. I caught fragments as I passed near the side yard with a tray of empty glasses, and an address repeated back. A confirmation of some kind. A short understood. That sentence more like something you'd say to a superior officer than to a friend. Daniel's posture had changed entirely by the time he hung up. He wasn't fidgeting anymore. He was still the particular stillness of someone who has just been given instructions and is now simply waiting to carry them out. Ryan noticed it, too, eventually, though he read it completely wrong. "Hey, you good?" he called out, waving his drink toward Daniel with the easy confidence of a man who assumes every problem in the room is smaller than his own. "You've been on that phone for 20 minutes. Everything okay with the business?" Daniel looked at him for a second, too long before answering. "Everything's fine," he said. "Just handling something." "You're being weird, man," Ryan said, laughing already, turning back toward the group of cousins he'd been entertaining. "Come, get a beer. You look like you saw a ghost." Daniel didn't move toward the cooler. He stayed near the edge of the patio, instead, close enough to the driveway that I understood without being told that he was watching for something. I went back to clearing plates, telling myself it was none of my business that whatever had rattled him wasn't connected to me. Looking back now, I think some part of me already suspected otherwise. There was a way he kept glancing at my wrist, quick and involuntary, that told me this wasn't unrelated at all. My mother asked me to help carry the cake back out for a second round of coffee, and I was balancing the tray on one arm when I heard it. The low, distinct rumble of engines, pulling up outside more than one vehicle, moving with a kind of coordinated precision that civilian traffic doesn't have. My father's house sits on a quiet cul-de-sac. Cars don't usually arrive there like that. Ryan heard it too. "What's going on out there?" he asked, half amused, already assuming it was nothing more than a neighbor's landscaping crew or a delivery truck taking up too much road. He looked toward Daniel, still grinning, still certain the afternoon belonged entirely to him. "Seriously, what's with you today?" Daniel didn't answer him. He was already moving toward the front of the house. I set the tray down on the counter and followed, not because I understood what was happening, but because every instinct I'd built over more than a decade of service was telling me that something had changed in the air, the way the pressure shifts before a storm breaks. My mother followed behind me, drying her hands on a dish towel, confusion written plainly across her face. My father stood up from his chair for the first time in an hour. Ryan trailed after us, still holding his drink, still wearing the loose, unbothered smile of a man who has never once in his life had to prepare himself for a moment he didn't control. "Seriously, who's out there?" he asked again, laughing under his breath, glancing at Daniel like he expected him to be in on some joke. Daniel reached the front door first. He didn't answer Ryan. He just looked back at me once with an expression I hadn't seen on him all day. Something between apology and awe. Like a man who wasn't sure if he'd just done the right thing or opened a door that couldn't be closed again. "You'll see," he said quietly, and then he opened it. Outside the driveway and the curb in front of it were no longer empty. 15 minutes had passed since that second phone call. 15 minutes, and now there was a knock at the door that hadn't come yet, but was already unmistakably on its way. 2 black SUVs sat at the curb in front of my father's house. Engines still running, government plates catching the afternoon light. A third vehicle pulled in behind them as I stepped out onto the porch, and for a moment, the entire party seemed to hold its breath in unison. 30 relatives crowding toward the windows and the front door, drinks forgotten in their hands. Ryan pushed past his own guests to get a better look, and I heard him mutter, mostly to himself, that someone must have the wrong address. It was a reasonable assumption. Nothing about our quiet cul-de-sac with its trimmed hedges and inflatable birthday balloons tied to the mailbox suggested it belonged in the same sentence as vehicles like that. The doors opened. 2 men stepped out first, both in dress uniform, both moving with the unhurried, deliberate pace of people who do this often enough that urgency has been replaced by precision. I recognized the insignia before I recognized either man's face, a full colonel, and beside him a lieutenant colonel I didn't know personally, but whose bearing I understood immediately. Behind them, a third figure remained near the vehicle, clearly waiting. clearly there in a supporting role rather than a leading one. The chatter behind me died completely. My mother's hand found my father's arm. Ryan had gone very quiet, the kind of quiet that comes from a man recalculating something in real time and not liking any of the numbers. The colonel came up the front walk first, scanning the small crowd gathered at the door with the kind of practiced attention that misses nothing. His eyes found me almost immediately, and something in his expression settled like a man confirming a detail he'd already been fairly certain of. "Major Audrey Cooper," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yes, sir," I answered, stepping forward. What happened next unfolded in a way that made my chest tighten, though I kept my face as composed as I've trained myself to keep it in rooms far more difficult than this one. Both officers came to a stop in front of me and extended their hands, not the casual half handshake people give in social settings, but something with actual weight behind it. The kind of greeting reserved for people whose service means something to the person offering it. "Ma'am," the colonel said, "I apologize for interrupting your family's afternoon. This couldn't wait, and given the circumstances, we felt it was better handled in person than over the phone." He handed me a sealed folder. I could feel the eyes of everyone on that porch locked onto the exchange, onto the deference in his posture, onto the folder now in my hands with a classification marking visible along the edge. "We need your signature and your input today," he said. "There's a situation developing that requires your assessment specifically. Given your background with the program, there wasn't another option." I nodded, already scanning, the first page already shifting without meaning, into the version of myself I don't often bring home. Somewhere behind me I heard my aunt whisper something to my uncle low and startled. I heard Megan's voice quiet, asking Ryan if he'd known about any of this. I heard nothing at all from Ryan. I glanced up once, just briefly, and found the entire party frozen in a kind of stunned recalibration. The cousin who'd laughed loudest at Ryan's jokes an hour earlier was now staring at me like she was seeing a stranger standing in my clothes. Greg, who'd chuckled along about my extended vacation, had gone pale near the punch bowl. My father stood absolutely still in the doorway, his mouth slightly open, looking at me the way you look at someone you thought you already knew completely. The lieutenant colonel spoke next, addressing me with the same formal weight. "We can step somewhere private if that's easier for the family." He offered, glancing briefly past me into the house, clearly aware of the audience we'd drawn. I appreciated the offer, but there wasn't much point in pretending anymore that this could be smoothed over quietly. I asked my father if we could use his study, and he nodded, still too stunned to form words, and led the way without a single question. As I turned to follow, I caught Ryan's face for just a second. Whatever performance he'd been running all afternoon had drained completely out of him. He looked smaller, somehow standing there in his own doorway, his drink hanging forgotten in his hand, staring at the space where two military officers had just addressed his sister with more respect in 30 seconds than he'd shown her in years. I didn't say anything to him. There wasn't time, and honestly, I wasn't sure yet what I would have said if there had been. Inside the study, the colonel laid out the details of what had prompted the visit, a scheduling conflict involving a logistics assessment I'd been overseeing remotely. One that had escalated faster than expected and required my signature before the end of the day, regardless of where I happened to be. It was in the end a matter of paperwork and protocol, nothing dramatic in itself. But paperwork carried by two colonels to a birthday party delivered with that particular formality said something no explanation needed to spell out. Through the study door, I could hear the party outside, slowly finding its voice again. Hushed conversations rippling through the yard, my mother's voice rising above the rest, as and failed to explain something she herself didn't fully understand yet. Whatever version of me my brother had built for that room over the years, it had just been quietly, irreversibly replaced by something closer to the truth. Signing the paperwork took less than 10 minutes. What took longer was walking back out into a party that had transformed entirely in my absence, the air thick with a kind of charged silence I'd never once experienced in my parents' backyard. The colonel and lieutenant colonel didn't leave right away. My father, still visibly shaken, insisted they at least have coffee before driving back. And to my surprise, they accepted. I think some part of him needed the extra minutes. Needed proof that this wasn't some strange hallucination, brought on by too much wine and an overwhelming week. We settled at the patio table, the four of us, while the rest of the party hovered at a respectful distance, close enough to listen, careful not to look like they were listening. It was the colonel who brought it up, not me. I wouldn't have volunteered it. "I imagine your family knows about Kandahar," he said, stirring his coffee, glancing at me with an expression that assumed far more than was true. When I didn't answer right away, something shifted in his face. "They don't know," he said, not quite a question this time either. My mother set her cup down carefully. "Know what?" The colonel looked at me for permission. A small nod, more out of resignation than anything else. "There's a particular exhaustion that comes from having spent years keeping something folded up small and private, only to have it unfold itself in front of you, regardless of what you wanted," he told them in the measured economical language officers use for things that matter too much for embellishment, about a convoy hit by an IED outside a forward operating base, about a logistics officer who'd gone back into a burning vehicle, not once but twice, to pull out 2 wounded soldiers before the flames made it impossible to go back a third time. He mentioned the scar on my arm, without dramatizing it, the way you'd mention any documented detail in an official account. He mentioned a commendation that had been awarded afterward, when I'd accepted quietly without a ceremony, without telling anyone beyond my direct chain of command. My mother's hand went to her mouth. My father sat completely still, his coffee cooling untouched in front of him, staring at me like he was trying to reconcile the daughter he'd raised with the version of events now sitting across the table from him. Daniel, standing a few feet back near the edge of the patio, nodded slowly through the whole account, confirming with his silence that this matched exactly what he'd pieced together hours earlier from nothing more than a scar and a half-remembered story. "Why?" my mother finally asked, her voice thin. "Why would you never tell us any of this?" I thought about that question for a moment before answering, because it deserved a real answer rather than a deflection. "Because it wasn't a story to me," I said. "It was just the job. And because the 2 soldiers I pulled out that day didn't get to go home and tell their families anything. One of them still can't walk without help. I never felt like it was something to be proud of in front of people. It just felt like something I had to live with." The patio had gone entirely silent by then, the rest of the party listening openly now, no longer pretending otherwise. I could see my aunt's eyes glistening. I could see Greg staring at the ground, clearly replaying his earlier laughter in his head. I could see Megan watching Ryan, waiting for some reaction that hadn't come yet. Ryan, for his part, was standing near the sliding door, with his arms crossed. And I watched something stubborn settle over his features, the particular expression he gets when reality refuses to match the story he's already decided to believe. "Okay, this is a lot," he said finally, forcing a short laugh that didn't land anywhere near the way he wanted it to. "I mean, come on. 2 colonels show up at a birthday party with folders and medals talk, and everyone's supposed to just believe this whole secret hero thing." He looked around at the rest of the family, like he expected someone to back him up. Nobody did. "I'm not saying you're lying," he added, quieter now, though the words still carried an edge. "I just think maybe this is a bit much for a Saturday afternoon." The colonel's expression didn't change, but something in his posture straightened slightly, the kind of shift I recognized from years of watching him handle skepticism from far higher-ranking people than my brother. "I understand this is unexpected," he said evenly, "but I can assure you, sir, nothing about this is theater. Major Cooper's file isn't something we discuss lightly, and we wouldn't have made this drive for anything less than an operational necessity." Ryan didn't respond to that directly. He just looked at me instead, and for the first time all day, I saw something other than smugness in his expression, something closer to disbelief mixed with a flicker of unease, like a man standing on ground he'd assumed was solid, and suddenly feeling it shift beneath him. My father finally spoke, his voice rough. "All these years," he said mostly to himself, and we had no idea. He reached over and took my hand, something he hadn't done since I was a teenager, and held it for a long moment without saying anything else. I didn't know yet how much further this was going to unravel, or how much of Ryan's certainty about who I was, and who he was by comparison, was about to come apart entirely before the afternoon was over. The Colonel stayed only a little longer after that, long enough to finish his coffee and answer a few careful questions from my parents. But before he left, he said something that shifted the entire afternoon in a direction none of us saw coming. "I should mention," he said, setting his cup down and glancing briefly at Ryan, "Major Cooper's current role goes beyond her field record. She's been serving on the Technical Evaluation Board for a defense logistics modernization program for the past 2 years. Contracts, infrastructure assessments, vendor capability reviews, that kind of work." He said it plainly, the way you'd mention any other detail of someone's job, with no idea what those words would do to the man standing near the sliding door. I watched Ryan's face change in real time. It was subtle at first, a small tightening around his eyes, the particular stillness of someone doing rapid math they didn't want to be doing. I knew immediately what he was thinking, because I'd known for over a year, ever since a name had crossed my desk during a routine review cycle, and I'd recognized it instantly. Cooper Builders submitting a bid on a regional infrastructure contract, a project that would have meant everything to a company as overextended as his. I hadn't said anything to him then. I hadn't said anything to anyone, actually, because the review process is supposed to be exactly that, a process insulated from who you happen to be related to. His company's bid had come in with structural documentation that didn't hold up under technical review. Unrelated to price, unrelated to reputation, just a straightforward engineering shortfall that any evaluator would have flagged, regardless of whose name was on the paperwork. I'd recused myself from that particular file, the moment I recognized it exactly as protocol required, and passed it to a colleague instead. I never told Ryan that. I never told anyone in the family. It wasn't my story to tell, and more than that, I didn't want him to think even for a second that I'd had any hand in what happened to his bid, good or bad. But now, standing on the patio with 2 colonels, and half our extended family listening, the coincidence was laid bare in front of him, without any of that context attached, and I could see him assembling the worst possible version of events in his head. "Wait," he said slowly, his voice dropping into something quieter and more dangerous than his usual bluster. "You're telling me my sister had something to do with reviewing government contracts the same year my company got denied on the Meridian Ridge project?" He looked at me now, and the expression on his face had shifted entirely confusion, curdling fast into something closer to accusation. "Did you do that? Did you have something to do with us losing that bid?" "No," I said, keeping my voice level, though the unfairness of the question stung more than I expected it to. "I recused myself the second I saw your company's name on the file. I never touched your bid. I never spoke to anyone about it." "That's not how the process works? And even if it were, I never would have done that to you." Ryan didn't look like he believed me, not entirely. But I also don't think he wanted to argue the point directly in front of a colonel who could presumably confirm every word I'd just said. Instead, something else in him seemed to give way, some final piece of the story he'd told himself for years finally cracking under its own weight. "So, this whole time," he said quieter now, almost to himself, "you knew exactly what was happening with the company. You knew what I was going through, and you never said a word." "What would I have said, Ryan?" I asked. And, for the first time all day, I let a little more of what I was actually feeling into my voice. "You never once asked me what I actually do. Not this year, not 5 years ago, not ever. You've spent years deciding what my life looked like, without ever checking if any of it was true. I didn't hide anything from you. You just never asked." He didn't have an answer for that. I watched him open his mouth, and then close it again. The practiced confidence that usually filled every room he walked into nowhere to be found. Around us, the party had gone almost completely silent, the kind of silence that settles over people who realize they're witnessing something they shouldn't interrupt. My mother reached out and touched Ryan's arm gently the way she used to, when we were kids, and one of us had gone quiet after a fight. He pulled away, not unkindly, just instinctively, the way a person does when they need a moment alone with their own thoughts, rather than comfort from someone else. He walked a few steps toward the edge of the yard, and stood there with his back to the rest of us, staring out at nothing in particular. The colonel, sensing the moment had turned into something private, thanked my parents for the coffee and told me quietly that he'd follow up on the paperwork through normal channels. He shook my hand again before he left, and this time he added, almost as an afterthought, "For what it's worth, Major, the Army's lucky to have officers who keep their heads down and let the work speak for itself. Not enough people left who do that." I thanked him, though the words landed strangely in the middle of everything else happening around us. As the two SUVs pulled away from the curb, I glanced over at Ryan, still standing alone at the edge of the yard, shoulders tight, staring at a version of his sister he'd apparently never once considered might exist. I didn't go to him yet. Some things need a little space before they can be said honestly, and I could tell neither of us was ready. The party didn't really recover after that. Guests drifted out in small groups over the next hour, offering quiet, awkward goodbyes to my parents. The kind of exit people make when they've witnessed something too personal to comment on directly. By the time the last car pulled out of the driveway, the backyard looked strange in its emptiness. Folding chairs still arranged in loose circles. Half-finished plates of cake sitting out in the fading light, balloons drooping slightly against the fence. I found Ryan sitting alone on the back steps, elbows on his knees, staring at the grass like it owed him an explanation. I sat down beside him without saying anything at first. For a while, neither of us spoke. It had been a long time since we'd shared a silence that wasn't loaded with something unspoken underneath it. And this one oddly felt different. Not comfortable exactly, but honest in a way our conversations rarely were anymore. I don't even know where to start. He finally said, not looking at me, "I've spent years telling people you don't do anything real." I said it so many times I actually started believing it myself. He shook his head slowly. "And the whole time you were out there doing that, saving people, getting hurt doing it, and I was standing at parties making jokes about you living off mom and dad." I let him sit with that for a moment before I answered. "You don't need to relitigate every conversation we've ever had," I said. "That's not why I told the colonel it was fine to talk in front of everyone." I paused, choosing the next part carefully because it mattered more to me than anything about the medals or the file or the scar. "The thing that actually hurt today wasn't what you said at the party. People say careless things all the time, and I've gotten good at letting that roll off me. What hurt was realizing you've believed it for years, that you built an entire idea of who I am and never once thought to check if it was true." Ryan didn't argue. That more than anything told me how much the afternoon had actually landed on him. The old Ryan would have found some way to defend himself by now, some angle to argue that made him the reasonable one. Instead, he just sat there quiet, turning something over in his head that looked less like a rebuttal and more like the beginning of an actual reckoning. "I think," he said slowly, "I needed you to be the one who didn't have it figured out. It made it easier to feel okay about my own mess. If you were just coasting, then it didn't matter that the company's barely holding on, or that Megan and I have been fighting about money for a year, or that I lost that Meridian Ridge bid, and I still don't fully understand why. It was easier to make you the problem than to look at my own." He finally looked over at me, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, there wasn't a trace of performance in his expression. "I'm sorry. Not just for today, for a long time before today." I didn't offer him an easy absolution, because I didn't think that's what he actually needed from me. "I appreciate you saying that," I told him, "but this isn't something that gets fixed with one conversation on a back step. It's going to take longer than that for me to trust that you actually see me differently now, and not just because two colonels showed up unannounced." He nodded, accepting that, which itself felt like progress. My parents came out a little while later, and my mother sat down on Ryan's other side, resting her head briefly against his shoulder before turning to me. "We should have asked more questions over the years too," she said quietly. We let your brother's version of things fill up all the space in this family. That's on us as much as it's on him. My father, standing behind us with his hands in his pockets, nodded in agreement, though he didn't trust himself to say much more than that. Daniel found me by my car as I was getting ready to leave. He looked lighter than he had all afternoon, like a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had finally set itself down. "I've heard that story for years," he said. "Never had a face to put with it. Kind of strange, finding out the woman from the story was standing in Ryan's backyard the whole time getting mocked over potato salad." He extended his hand and I shook it. "Thank you for your service. I don't say that lightly, and I don't think you hear it enough. I just did my job." I said the same answer I always give, though this time it felt a little less like deflection, and a little more like the plain truth it actually was. I drove home as the sun dropped low over the tree line, the day settling into something quieter than it started. Ryan had a long road ahead of him if he wanted to actually change, not just apologize once and consider the matter closed, but something had shifted today that couldn't be undone. The version of me he'd built out of assumption and convenience had finally collided with the truth, and he was going to have to live with that collision for a while, before he came out the other side of it, if he ever fully did. I thought about the 2 soldiers I'd pulled out of that convoy all those years ago, about how neither of them ever asked me to explain myself, how the people who understand real cost rarely need the story spelled out for them. Maybe that's the lesson in all of this. Respect shouldn't require proof. It shouldn't take a colonel showing up with a folder to make someone finally look at the people closest to them and wonder if they've been getting the story wrong all along. I want to know what you would have done in my shoes, sitting through all those years of being underestimated by someone who should have known better. Leave a comment below and let me know where you're watching from tonight. We've got so many more stories like this one to share with you. So make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Let's keep this journey going together.